how did Joseph talk to the women? Did he manipulate them? But none of the stories are saying to the woman, if you don't go forward, you're going to be damned, or you're going to have an eternal penalty for not being my plural wife. That wasn't his message, because as I said, 5 women turned him down. Nothing happened.
Welcome, Brother Hales, and thank you for being on the channel today.
It's a privilege. Thank you for having me.
I was just telling our viewers that we're gonna cover a bit of polygamy and Joseph Smith's polygamy, but many of our viewers may not be familiar with your work. So could you tell us what you do in regards to polygamy?
I have authored 7 different books that deal with plural marriage, and 4 of them deal specifically with José Smith. And I also have a website called josephsmithspolygamy.org. And unfortunately, it is only in English. We had a translation app attached to it, but it didn't work very well. So we've removed it. But so that's a primary issues. I was able to help a little with the gospel topic essay back in 2013 when that came out, 2014.
Okay, thank you so much. And, it will be interesting to go over polygamy. And something that I've noticed that is pretty common in Latin America is that there's a general understanding of polygamy, and it can go 2 ways. It can go, maybe the approach to polygamy is based on rumors, and that's it. For example, I once watched a YouTube video about a preacher I think it was in Guatemala, and he stopped 2 missionaries and he said, "Hey, did you know that Joseph Smith had like 100 children?" And that's confirmed. So there's that understanding of polygamy, and on the other hand, there's people who maybe have read maybe saints or other documents that tackle polygamy, and they are based on facts, but their approach is pretty sarcastic. So there hasn't been maybe an unbiased or objective view of the topic. So maybe we can start with that, and through this interview, help our listeners and viewers know the facts, and so they can, come to their own conclusions. So the first question is regarding to the understanding of polygamy that we've had in the church throughout the years. So could you tell us a little bit about how polygamy has been taught in the church throughout the years?
Great question. And I wish there were a real short version, but Joseph Smith learned in the 1830s that God wanted plural marriage, the practice, restored. And he tried it once in 1835, and it didn't turn out very well. And he didn't want to do it again, but God commanded him through an angel a couple of more times saying, do this. And so it was secretly taught before his death in Nauvoo, but it wasn't publicly taught to church members until 1852. And then it was taught as an expectation for, if you were devout, then you would be a polygamist, was kind of the expectation, until 1890, when that was changed and it was no longer taught as an expectation, but there were still some people secretly doing it. And then in 1904, the church president, who was Joseph F. Smith, at that point said, we're not going to do it anymore. And he held the keys of sealing. You can't freelance or perform an eternal marriage, whether it's monogamous or polygamous. You can't do that and have God recognize it unless you have authorization from the church president, who holds the keys of sealing authority. And that man in 1904 said, we're not doing it anymore. But there were people outside of the church and people who were excommunicated from the church because they continued to practice some kind of polygamy. And they got a lot of media attention in the United States in the 1940s and 50s. And so church leaders decided to emphasize we are just a monogamous church. And they didn't really talk about our polygamous past. They wanted people to know we are different from those polygamists that are getting all the media attention. And I think that is a little unfortunate, because then for decades, clear up past the year 2000, there are church members like me and you who may not have known that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, because the emphasis was on the monogamy practice of the church. And so around the 2005, 2010, church leaders are saying, okay, we need to update our narrative to include everything with transparency. And so they came out with the gospel topic essay in 2014, I think it was. And that was the one that talks about Joseph Smith as a polygamist, and that uses very frank language. All of the controversies are mentioned. And then later, the book Saints has come out, and that talks about all the controversies too. So members who are familiar with either of those documents are going to know Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. But unless they've really tuned into those kinds of things, they may say, whoa, I never heard this, and why not? Well, I think it was because the church for decades had decided they weren't going to talk about anything but our monogamy, because they didn't want us to be confused with these unauthorized and excommunicated polygamists.
Okay, I understand it. And just like you mentioned, I remember that maybe when I was 7 or 8, I watched a video about Joseph Smith having many wives, and I remember that was a common joke in movies or between members, so I always thought it was a joke. But then when I was around 14, I took the Doctrine and Covenants course in seminary, and then we got to section 132, and then I learned, oh, okay, I get it. And then I learned about the official declaration, the first official declaration, and I thought, oh, so it's true. Um, so I remember that in my case, when I first learned about it, I didn't feel awkward or betrayed. It was more like, oh, so it was true. But as years have gone by, I've understand, well, all the different controversies surrounding it. But before we delve into those, what do we know about Joseph's own feelings towards polygamy?
The historical record doesn't really tell us what we would really like to know. The biggest problem, Gustavo, I think that we encounter is that even church members are going to worry, and the critics or non-members are going to accuse Joseph Smith as being driven by libido or by a sex drive. That it's the argument that is very obvious if you read the documents, is that Joseph was commanded, he didn't want to do it. I think that's very obvious if you get into the actual documents. But nobody does that. They just want to make an assumption, and they're going to assume, if they're outside of the church, that Joseph was doing what other charismatic males have done. They're eventually having sexual relations with their followers. It has happened over and over. Jim Jones is a name. David Koresh, these are in the United States. Jeff Lundgren, there's a lot of examples. And so to just group Joseph Smith with these others is a very easy thing to do mentally. And so we have to fight that with true documents. Joseph Smith related an angel, commanded him to do it. When he started to do these plural sealings, the first half dozen or so were sealings that didn't involve sexuality. They were sealings to legally married women. And Joseph Smith never permitted or practiced polyandry, which is where he would have been a second husband for a woman. That did not happen, contrary to what all the critics say. It really didn't, and we can show that, I think, pretty convincingly. But the first marriages were of this type, which is a really weird kind of polygamy to introduce if sex is driving you. And yet he related how an angel came for a third time. It was in February of 1842. And when we look at the timeline, after that date, Joseph Smith is proposing to women who haven't any legal husbands. They're single. And then we can document that some of these marriages were consummated. In other words, Joseph did have sexual relations with these wives, but there's none of that for the women with legal husbands. And so we see a pattern here where he didn't want to do it. He only was sealed to women for the next life. And then finally the angel comes and commands it a third time. And so he participates just like Abraham in the Old Testament, just like Jacob, who became Israel in the Old Testament. These men were polygamists, and Joseph Smith became that kind of a polygamist.
It's interesting because when we talk about polygamy, well, it can be very weird. And we can imagine modern day examples, as you mentioned, of people who have abused that power. So even though polygamy isn't, well, very common nowadays, why is Joseph's practice different from modern day examples like Warren Jeffs, for example?
That's a really good question. Warren Jeffs, as an example, has perverted plural marriage perhaps more than anybody else who's abusing it in our day. The biggest problem, though, I see with Warren Jeffs and with so many of these leaders is that if you study church history, Joseph Smith is the president of the church. Section 107 tells us that if the president of the high priesthood, if the president of the church should apostatize or teach false doctrine, then he can be tried by a council of the church. Now, that's never happened. But the point is that Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, none of these leaders were they all were susceptible to church discipline if they made a mistake requiring it. But these false leaders outside of the church, like Warren Jeffs, he has all power. There is no way to remove him. And of course, there's a saying in English, and I don't know how well it would translate, but it says that if a person has all power, they will be completely corrupted by that power. And so Warren Jeffs is all powerful in his church, and nobody can question him. And even Joseph Smith was president of the church, but he was susceptible to a council of the church. So if you're going to have something that's truly from God, the leader is not going to be above the discipline of the priesthood quorums and councils. So Warren Jeffs has all power, and so he's telling the women how to dress. He's telling which women can marry other women. See, in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith arranged some marriages, but some of those marriages, the women didn't want to do it. And you know what happened? Absolutely nothing. They didn't have to do it. Lucy Walker remembered Joseph's teaching that a woman would have her choice. That could not be denied her. But Warren Jeffs is telling the woman what to do, and if she won't do it, she's excommunicated. So he's way off the mark. And as an example. But the biggest problem for these polygamists that are outside of the church is they don't have authority. They claim authority, priesthood authority, the sealing authority through men who, if you study their lives, it's pretty obvious they did not hold the same keys that Joseph held, because if they did, they would be sending out missionaries besides, because they'd have the keys to gather Israel. They would have the keys to do temple work, but they aren't building temples. And they would have the keys to seal marriages. So these offshoots simply are not doing the work that the keys are designed to do. The keys of the kingdom are and some of those keys allow for eternal marriage. And when the key holder allows, there can be plural marriage, but that isn't happening today because Russell M. Nelson is not allowing it.
And Now that we cover a little bit about what polygamy is, what's the take of the church on the subject, what do we know about how Joseph felt about it, and how that practice compares to some mundane examples, I'd like to play a little devil's advocate and just, looking at it from an outsider's perspective or a critic's perspective, just to, see how we reconcile information, how we see information maybe differently. One of the things that many people mention is the fact that Joseph, and maybe while he explained the command of the angel or invited women to seek spiritual confirmation of it, might have sounded manipulative, or that he was trying to use promise of eternal life to convince them to say yes. So that's one criticism. And another one's that I've heard, for example, that maybe one time Joseph, a woman rejected him, and I think that he insulted her in a newspaper. So those are some criticisms. How valid are they, or what do we know based on the documents?
The way Joseph Smith would propose plural marriage varied, but several of them would involve an intermediary. In other words, Joseph would say, I am interested in marrying so and so, and he would tell someone in between, a brother, a father, or something like that. That didn't happen all the time. And they would just see if she was interested. If she wasn't, then it died right there. In fact, we have a record that Joseph Smith was turned down 7 different times. And 5 of those records were by active women in the church. And the only reason we know Joseph proposed to those 5 women is because they later talked about it or their family mentioned it. In other words, these 5 women turned Joseph down, and Joseph did nothing. He didn't go after them. He didn't publicly destroy their reputations. He didn't threaten them with excommunication. He just went forward. Now, there were 2 women, Jane Law and Sarah Pratt, who came out openly and accused Joseph of things that he later denied. And I think that Joseph never would have proposed anything but a plural marriage that the woman could turn down. The woman said that he made overtures towards her and stuff, which were very ambiguous. And there's no evidence that Joseph ever would have had or tolerated any kind of a sexual relationship without being married to the woman. But when it hit the press, Joseph Smith is portrayed very negatively. So he defended himself. And one of the women, Sarah Pratt, that I mentioned, she is documented as having a relationship with John C. Bennett. And Sarah Pratt was married to Orson Pratt, and they later divorced, and she left the church. So I think that's probably very true, that she was having an affair with Bennett, but then accused Joseph. And Jane Law was William Law's wife. And according to that, there's a lot of different quotations that have contradictory stories, but it sounds that the one I believe is that Jane's husband was not worthy to be sealed to her. You have to, even in Nauvoo, if you're going to be involved in an eternal marriage, you have to be worthy. They didn't do temple recommend interviews at that day, but you had to be worthy. And her husband wasn't worthy for her to be sealed to. And so she was happy to be sealed to Joseph, and that was spun to be some kind of an illicit proposal. Nobody ever accused Joseph Smith of proposing something that was illicit and then following through. No woman ever came out and said Joseph had adultery. We had an adulterous relationship together. There were just people wanting to accuse him of things that I think they were very much exaggerating. Because if Joseph were going to be doing this kind of thing, somebody would have mentioned that it had happened. And so it never did. Joseph wasn't perfect. Don't get me wrong, but he was always worthy. That's an important message, is that my research shows that while Joseph stumbled and did things that I kind of wish he maybe would not have been sealed to 14-year-old girls. He never, as far as we have evidence, he didn't consummate those. He didn't go to bed with these 14-year-olds, and the marriages were arranged by other men, and Joseph just went along and with it. But it looks really bad today for us to say Joseph was sealed to a 14-year-old, even if it was just a marriage that was going to blossom later and be consummated when she was older. Because in Utah, the policy was you wouldn't consummate a plural marriage till the woman was 18 or 19. And I believe that policy began with Joseph. I can't prove that, but there's no evidence Joseph is having sex with 14-year-olds or seeking out 14-year-olds or 15-year-olds. He was sealed to two 14-year-olds and a 16-year-old, and there's no evidence of sexuality in any of those marriages. And the marriage with the 16-year-old ended in divorce, which would have been highly unlikely if they had consummated that marriage. So I'm getting off topic, Gustavo. I apologize for that, but maybe you can redirect me back to where you want us to go here.
No, that's great. I think that, as you mentioned, when we talk about polygamy, we can cover many different topics. And yeah, you talk about the times that Joseph was rejected and what we know about what he did or how these women reacted. And you mentioned John C. Bennett. You mentioned an adulterous relationship with him. So many of our listeners may not be very familiar with him, but I think that understanding what happened with him can help us, better understand how Joseph actually practiced polygamy. So could you tell us a little bit about Bennett?
Sure. And let me just mention, Gustavo, I served a mission in Venezuela in the 70s, and I want to apologize because I wish I could do this in Spanish. I wish my Spanish were good enough. Yo quiero que ustedes saben que me gusta el idioma español tanto y me gustaría hablar en español, pero hace falta las palabras al hablar de poligamia, ¿cómo se dice? Y por eso tengo que hablar en inglés, pero perdóneme mucho, porque me gusta el idioma mucho. Let me mention John C. Bennett, and if you don't mind me backing up, I can see in the early days of the church a chess match, and I can see God is doing one thing and Satan is doing another. It's like the Book of Mormon comes forth in 1830 and 1833. There's this manuscript that's lost called the Solomon Spaulding manuscript, and it becomes this theory to explain the Book of Mormon. It doesn't. They find it 50 years later, and they know it's not a theory. And then we get into 1836, and there's this wonderful experience in the Kirtland Temple. And by 1837, the Kirtland Safety Society Bank is failing, and there's this great apostasy. And then we get to Nauvoo, and Joseph is introducing his greatest teaching of eternal marriage, and John C. Bennett shows up. And John C. Bennett is very charismatic, and he knows people. He helps get the city of Nauvoo established with the state government. And so he has skills that Joseph needs, but he also is an adulterer. And it's well known that before he got to Nauvoo, he's an adulterer. He gets to Nauvoo, he continues his adultery, but he does it secretly. So you have Joseph doing secret plural marriage, eternal marriage, and you have John C. Bennett doing secret adultery. And so it's corrupting. People are getting confused, and they're hearing rumors, and that people don't know what to believe. And it just is ironic how when Joseph is doing something incredibly amazing, very shortly thereafter or at the same time, there's something that's going to make it much more difficult for that good thing to move forward with momentum. And John C. Bennett shows up, and he isn't a polygamy insider. People have said he was, but if you study when John C. Bennett arrives in 1840, 1841, 1842, he is given a title as an assistant counselor to the first presidency. Now, that sounds really impressive until you look at all the meetings of the first presidency and the Quorum of the 12. He's never invited to any of them. He doesn't attend any of them. But when they need a good public speaker who can promote Nauvoo and promote the things that are happening, not the church things, but just the general public good, he's recruited to do that. But behind the scenes, he's an adulterer. It is exposed in 1842. And he's excommunicated and he leaves town. But one of the reasons he's excommunicated is because he's accused of having an affair with Sarah Pratt. And I think the data is pretty strong on this. I've written a very long article that was published in a journal on John C. Bennett. If somebody's interested, you can go to josephsmithspolygamy.org, go up to the links and you'll find it there among the articles. So that's John C. Bennett.
Yeah.
Oh, and let me add one more thing. You've asked me twice, and I keep forgetting to respond. How did Joseph talk to the women? Did he manipulate them? And there is a woman, Lucy Walker, that Joseph proposed to, and she waited. She didn't know what to do. And months went by, and she's just waiting, and Joseph isn't putting pressure on her. But then she says, I was just so depressed and sad, and I could hardly go on. And Joseph saw how bad I felt. And Joseph says, okay, we're going to resolve this. I'm going to give you 24 hours to resolve this. And sometimes anti-Mormons will just say that Joseph walked up to a woman and gave her 24 hours to decide. That's not what happened. This is the only case where we have a timeline from Joseph, and it was 24 hours. But the interesting thing is, Lucy Walker related how that very night she had an angel who visited her and convinced her to go forward, which is not something Joseph would have been able to conjure up. God is there sustaining this very difficult practice. And so the next day, she is sealed to Joseph Smith and is a plural wife of Joseph Smith. And there are other women who hear the story that Joseph had an angel who came and commanded him to go forward. But none of the stories are saying to the woman, if you don't go forward, you're going to be damned, or you're going to have an eternal penalty for not being my plural wife. That wasn't his message, because as I said, 5 women turned him down. Nothing happened. These women married other men, and a couple of them were sealed to Joseph after his death in the temple, sealed to be his wife. And Brigham Young would only allow that if they had been approached by Joseph during his lifetime. So he wasn't manipulating them the way he is accused to. Quite honestly, the women wouldn't have put up with it. These women were just as skeptical about polygamy as we are today. And they weren't gullible dupes who were just saying, oh, Joseph, I'll be your wife, and all this nonsense. The critics portray these women as gullible dupes. They were not. They were skeptical. And God was there with visions, with dreams, with other manifestations that convinced them to go forward. And that's how he was able to do this. His charisma wasn't that great. He was charismatic, no question, but how do you get a woman to make those kind of sacrifices with just charisma? It wouldn't have happened. These supernatural things that God provided is what helped keep these women and make them willing to accept this very difficult practice.
Thank you, Brother Hales. And sorry if I maybe sound too critical with my questions, but I'm just trying to tackle some issues or maybe questions that I've seen people have, but no one ever actually talks about it, or they just dismiss it. Maybe with Helen Mark Campbell or Lucy Walker, people have questions about them, but I never, heard people maybe in Spanish explain them. So I thought it would be important, and thank you for your willingness to share that. And just one last question on maybe the devil's advocate side. I will turn more faithful as the questions continue.
It's fine. You can ask me any question. I call myself a transparencyist. I don't know how that translates into Spanish, but I believe if we study the primary documents, we aren't going to like polygamy. I don't like polygamy. It's unfair. Men can do it, women can't. You can't defend it as being fair. So I don't like the practice, but it's in the Bible and it raises up more believers, or at least it did in Joseph Smith's day. I have several polygamists in my own line. So I believe that if we're transparent, if we get all the data out there, there's lots of room to believe. There's lots of room for faith. But when people get their data through unbelievers, through anti-Mormons and critics, the ability to have faith is much more difficult. So please ask me any question. The answers are there. It just takes time to study them. And I believe in that information, there is a wide pathway for faith.
I understand. And as you mentioned, there are one criticism is brought up, it can, diminish or make less accessible a faithful approach or response. And one of these things is that, for example, when I was a kid and I watched the Joseph Smith Prophet of the Restoration movie, um, the last 10 minutes are about Carthage and Joseph's death. So the way they portray it is not very clear why they go to Carthage, but it's just, oh, the governor wants them to go there, and they get killed in the jail. So as we learn more about history, we realize that that was linked to the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor Press, and people claim that that's linked with polygamy. So people say that in a way, polygamy led to Joseph's death. And as they talk about the specifics and maybe the not very wise choices that Joseph made during those days, uh, people come to the conclusion that that diminishes his martyr status and that he didn't die defending the faith. He just died uh, trying to save his own skin, but couldn't do it. So what are your thoughts on, or could you explain to us a little bit more the relationship that polygamy had to Carthage, and if that taints or tarnishes Joseph's death?
Sure. No, it's a very, very good question, Gustavo. You've been very thoughtful in coming up with that. The process evolved this way. Joseph is secretly teaching plural marriage, and eventually he teaches William Law. Now, I mentioned him earlier. William Law, according to Hiram Smith, had confessed to being an adulterer, and so Joseph would not seal him and his wife. And if you read my volumes, I go through all the details because it's not clear exactly what's happening. But what does happen is that William Law opposes Joseph, and he publishes the Expositor. And in the Expositor, it does mention Joseph teaching plural marriage, but that's only one complaint. There are a number of other complaints. Joseph Smith and the church own building lots, and they're competing with William Law's building lots. They're both selling building lots. Another thing is Joseph wasn't perfect. I mean, he was very authoritarian. In other words, he was in charge, and he told us just weeks before he was killed. He said, "I never told you I was perfect, but there's no error in the revelations." And he had a temper, but as I've said before, Joseph wasn't perfect, but he was worthy. I don't find in his weaknesses anything that would have prevented him from being worthy to be our prophet. But I do see things that he probably would have had to repent of, like getting in a fisticuffs, a fist fight with his brother and with some other individuals, brother Butterfield there in Nauvoo. And so these weaknesses, and maybe he was authoritarian with William Law, but William Law pushes back. He publishes this paper. And the thing that they shouldn't have done, and at this time, Gustavo, I wish Joseph Smith was not the mayor. If Joseph would have just sat back and been president of the church and let other politicians make all of the decisions, then when they stumbled, because they absolutely had the right to destroy the newspaper that had been printed. They did not have authority as a city council, and Joseph is the mayor, but it's the city council decides to destroy the printing press. Now, that had happened with mob action in other places, but in Nauvoo, it wasn't tolerated. They shouldn't have done that. It was a mistake. There's no question. And so by destroying the press, they have now, that's something that on the frontier was not tolerated. The governor wouldn't tolerate that. Didn't matter what the justifications were. And so when they did this with Joseph being the mayor, he gets brought up on charges and goes to Carthage. But he, with his lawyers, is able to be discharged on bail, essentially. And he's going back to Nauvoo. And so they bring up another charge called treason, which you can't bail, you can't get out of that. And whether he was guilty of treason, it's ludicrous. I think I'm not an expert, but it's treason that keeps him in the jail until he is killed. It's not adultery, it's not these other charges, but the critics of the church are stretching the law to try to keep Joseph in that jail long enough for the mob to kill him. And it wasn't the charge of adultery or anything like this that was keeping him there, but it was one of the several charges from his enemies that they were able to recruit to get the printing press destroyed, and that was the real issue. So, I mean, we shouldn't expect Joseph to be perfect, but the idea that his sins against the state of Illinois or his foibles, his weaknesses justified his getting killed, that's ridiculous. Anybody who's saying that he wasn't a martyr is really mincing, is cutting things very finely and ignoring a whole elephant, if you will, that's in the room there. Absolutely, he was a martyr to his beliefs, and I find it unpersuasive for anybody to say that it would be otherwise.
And with the novel expositor, do we know do we know the contents of the newspaper, and do we know if they were true or lies or exaggerations?
Yeah, if you go to my website, mormonpolygamydocuments.org, you can put it in there. There's a transcript of everything that's in it. We know all about it. It had some inaccuracies, but it basically, and it really, the accusations weren't that strong, and that's why I kind of wish Joseph hadn't destroyed it as mayor. Okay, I think if he wouldn't have been mayor, he wouldn't have been able to be dragged over to Carthage as responsible for what the city council did. And I don't find that its accusations were necessarily that inflammatory, but the city council is the one that decided it was. And like I say, they could go to the printing press, to the office, and take all of the papers and burn them, but they shouldn't have touched the printing press itself. That was something that they didn't have authority to do. They overstepped their bounds. Joseph received credit for all of that as mayor, and I'm not totally familiar with all of the things that happened with the Nauvoo Council to determine that, but that was the biggest problem, and that's what got Joseph into the most trouble. So.
And now that we have covered a bit of the historical understanding that we have of polygamy, I just want to ask two last questions. The first those two questions are about the interpretation we can give polygamy now that it's been more than a century since the practice was ended. And, recently I've seen that there's been this rise in what if blank never actually happened. And I've seen videos that cover that for treasure digging for Joseph, his use of the seer stone. What if he actually never did that and it's just later documents? And now we've seen this uprise in the same thing being applied to polygamy. Like, what if that never happened? What if Brigham convinced women to say that they were married to Joseph? So I don't understand really the background. That was the Temple Lot trials or something like that. So is there any believability to this claim that maybe Joseph never actually practiced it?
It's a good question, and it's sad. I don't understand how this can happen, but there are several voices, and they've made videos, and they are rewriting history to their liking. In other words, the historical documents, every trained historian that I know understands Joseph was a polygamist. And there are not just dozens of supportive documents, there are hundreds, if not thousands. And I posted a lot of them on mormonpolygamydocuments.org. But we've got amateur historians who are untrained, and they don't use good technique. They what they do is they have this idea that Joseph didn't do it, and then they just go back into the historical record and they grab this quote and this quote, and they try to build a case around it, and they just ignore all kinds of other documents that disagree with their theory. And it's very poor scholarship. These voices are worthy of great criticism if we're interested in finding accurate reconstructions, finding the truth, if you will, historical truth on this topic. And they want to reduce this to the question of, well, who do we believe? Emma said Joseph didn't do it, and Brigham said Joseph did. Well, it's not that simple. We have several accounts that describe Emma being very much involved with polygamy, and they're from good sources. But since they don't support what these amateur historians are doing, they just ignore them. We don't like that. It's old, or that person was biased. They label these evidences that contradict their position, and there's dozens and hundreds of them, but they just label them all as not applicable. And then they're able to get this idea out there that Joseph wasn't a polygamist, for example. And it's just sad. It's unfortunate. And I put in the chat a link to a two-sided handout where I summarize Joseph never denied celestial plural marriage. He did deny unauthorized polygamy, spiritual wifery, and community of wives. And the amateur historian may say, well, see, he denied polygamy, therefore he couldn't have been doing eternal sealings that were plural marriages secretly. Well, that's not good logic. It's not good scholarship. But they're getting a following. It surprises me that these people are able to ignore so much data and keep this narrative alive. So yeah, please, I don't like polygamy any more than the next person, but I do think that the truth can make us free, and these falsehoods being taught really are not going to end well for those who embrace them. And of course, we'll watch these voices and see how their testimonies fare in the next decade or two. So
I understand. Thank you for sharing that. And I'll put up the links in the description so people can, as you mentioned, go into the documents. And this is, as I mentioned, one of the maybe recent movements or ideas. And now that we've had the gospel topics essay, now that we've had saints, now that we've had the CS letter and many documents that tackle topics that maybe weren't tackled with the same prominence as in earlier years. And I see that there's maybe this parallel between maybe the two major criticisms of the church. So that would be polygamy and race and the priesthood. And I think that with race and the priesthood, for example, many apologetic answers, many declarations in the last few years sort of treat the priesthood ban as a mistake. And they're not comfortable with even considering that maybe God did tell Brigham to do that. No, so it's widely considered as it was Brigham, but we don't explicitly say it. So that's another topic. But people can sometimes look at polygamy and think, do we think that polygamy is a mistake as the same way that is considered? Or do we consider it a doctrine? Do we really consider it as part of our history? And people have questions about what the implications are for the eternities and things like that. So what are your thoughts on this?
Again, Gustavo, that's a wonderful question. Plural marriage is a practice and a principle. And I did a study a few years ago, and church leaders referred to it as a doctrine, as a law, a commandment. They used a lot of words to describe it, but John Taylor used, I think, the best descriptions, and he said, it's a principle that's attached to the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. So it's eternal marriage, and sometimes it will include plural marriage. And eternal marriage is a doctrine. It's according to section 132, verses 16 and 17, that we have to be sealed in an eternal marriage and be worthy and be sealed by proper authority. Or in the next life, we will live separately and singly without exaltation in our saved condition to all eternity. And so you can say absolutely eternal marriage is needed. Now the question comes up, what about plural marriage? Well, if you look at section 132, Joseph asks about polygamy in verse 1. The Revelation doesn't mention polygamy for another 30 plus verses. God answers Joseph's question about polygamy by introducing eternal marriage. And then he returns to the discussion about plural marriage. But before he does that, he tells us in verses 19 and 20 that if a man marries a woman by proper authority and they live worthily, they become gods. I mean, it's exaltation. It's monogamy and it's exaltation, verses 19 and 20. So it tells us right there, very plain language, that a monogamous couple who are sealed by proper authority and live worthily can be exalted. Polygamy is not needed. It's not a condition of the law in verse 7. Okay, authority is the condition. You can't freelance plural marriage or anything. So here we find that the doctrine is eternal marriage, and then there's a principle that the key holder, the one man who holds the keys of sealing, can allow or not allow. Today, President Nelson is not allowing it. Okay, that was in 1904. Joseph S. Smith was the one who finally took that key away, disallowing any plural marriages. Every plural marriage after 1904 is invalid. And well, that's another discussion, but you can't practice plural marriage today. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, and when we talk about the understanding of it and how it fits into the doctrine, and right now this is just speculatory. There is no concrete answers, but when we think about it, if we believe that maybe Joseph was sealed for eternity only to such and such women, then by definition, that would mean that they will be Joseph's wives in the eternities. So there's this concept that even though polygamy has ended, it's sort of still there some way, as maybe people who remarry get sealed again. They get sealed twice, and and critics say that the practice is ongoing, but not as explicitly as before. And some people worry about what that looks like in heaven. I know we don't have a concrete answer for that, but what are your thoughts on those concerns?
Another good question, and it's pertinent because President Nelson's first wife passed away, and he is remarried and been sealed to his current wife, Elder Oaks. President Oaks is the same thing. She died of cancer, and then he is remarried. And each ceremony, and let me emphasize, polygamy is not an ordinance. It's not a covenant. It's simply a repetition. In other words, if a man is to become a polygamist, he's sealed to one wife in a sealing ceremony. And then that ceremony is repeated with another woman, but you don't know if the man has been sealed before. That's not part of the ordinance. Now, sometimes the first wife would put her hand on the hand of the second wife or something like that. That's not part of the ordinance. And it didn't happen in Nauvoo. We have several accounts showing that didn't always happen. So we shouldn't think that a person, if we're not doing polygamy in the church today, we're missing something. We're not. We are. If we weren't doing eternal marriages in the church, we would be missing something. But when it comes to eternity in the next life, as you pointed out, we don't know. We know almost nothing about eternal marriage, and we know even less about eternal plural marriage. But we do know this, and this is the important point. We need to live worthily. The authority to seal a man to one woman or to two women, or more, that is the same authority that can loosen those marriages. And we know this, the power to seal is the power to loosen. What does that mean? Well, what it means is before the resurrection, before the final judgment, all worthy men and women will be able to choose to be in a marriage dynamic and married to a person of their choosing, so that they can live joyfully throughout eternity. Nobody is going to be forced into any kind of a marriage or dynamic that they do not want, as long as they're worthy. And that will give them the ability to choose. And let me also say, the key holder, the prophet, has never said that all exalted men are polygamists. That is not a doctrine of our church. It never has been a doctrine of our church. Polygamy was commanded to show obedience between the 1840s and 1890. It's never mentioned as a commandment in the Book of Mormon, where we have very righteous people. In fact, in the history of this planet, the only people we know were commanded for a time to practice polygamy are the Latter-day Saints in these last days. So the idea that all exalted men are polygamists is simply not supported. I think it's a false teaching altogether. And so we need to recognize that that's what we're dealing with. I think there will be lots, and Brigham Young taught this, there would be lots of exalted monogamists in eternity. And we really can't speculate except to believe that God said if we live worthily and we're exalted, we will have eternal happiness, a fullness of joy. And the key is to be obedient and be sealed to a spouse. And if we don't have the opportunity here, but we're trying, then that can be done vicariously, by proxy, in temples later. But again, the key is to be worthy, to stay in the covenant path, and then it will take care of itself. And we don't need to worry about this eternal polygamy stuff, because we're worrying about something we don't understand, and it hasn't been revealed, so worrying about it isn't going to help. But we can believe that eternal happiness is ours if we live worthily.
Okay, thank you for sharing that, Brother Hales. And I think that with our conversation, maybe we just scratched the surface. There are things that we didn't cover. There could be, well, there's Fanny Alger, there's Helen Markimmel's experience, there's other saints' experiences with polygamy. We also have Brigham Young experiences, like many things that we didn't have the time to cover. But yeah, the purpose of the video maybe was not to answer every single question that can be had, but to open up the possibility that there's a faithful approach to it if we understand the facts. So as we conclude, Brother Hales, do you have any sources or channels or articles that you would recommend for someone who's interested in learning more about polygamy?
Yes, in fact, I just sent you, my website is called josephsmithspolygamy.org, and we referred to that earlier, but it's a great place to start. Again, I apologize, it is just in English, although I think Google now is doing some pretty good translating of the articles there. And then I have uploaded, again, this is part of my transparency attempt. When I finished writing my books, I had acquired 15 gigabytes of data, and I've uploaded all of that to a website called Mormon Polygamy Documents. And I will put that link in the chat, which you can include if you would like in the show notes. But if you're interested, go ahead and go there. But start with the book Saints and the Gospel Topic Essay. And let me just tell you that I don't like it, but we don't have to like it to believe that God would command it, because it's in the Old Testament. And I don't think that we're ever going to have to do it again. It may be permitted in the millennium. We don't know, but I personally don't think it'll ever be commanded. I don't think I'm going to be a polygamist in eternity, but we don't know how that's all going to work out. And so these are just unresolvable questions. So yeah, you'll be able to see those. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, perfect. Sure. I'll make sure to add them in the description. And as we wrap up, I think that I feel the same way. I understand the facts, but I might not necessarily feel happy about that. I might not be a fan of the practice or be a fan of how it was practice during this period of time. So you have also mentioned that, Brother Hales. For someone who has a hard time uh, under, accepting that polygamy was part of the church's history, um, just in your personal experience, uh, why did you choose to study polygamy, and how can someone who doesn't necessarily like it or agree with it can come to terms with it?
My interest began back in 1989 as a member of my family was excommunicated for joining one of the fundamentalist polygamous groups. As I researched their teachings, I was totally unconvinced by their claims to authority. And I wrote a book in 91, and then I wrote another one in 2006, but a lot of people were asking questions about Joseph. So I hired a research assistant in 2007 for 2 years, and he went out and got all these documents, and we brought him in, and I wrote 3 volumes on polygamy that talk about Joseph Smith and plural marriage. And so that's kind of where I got interested in all of this. And what was your second question?
It was, how can someone who doesn't like the practice, doesn't necessarily agree with it, how can someone come to terms with it? What would be your advice?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge a couple of things. As I've said before, Joseph Smith wasn't perfect, but in his behavior, and I've seen every document dealing with plural marriage. I think that there is, and certainly any that are pertinent. Joseph wasn't perfect, but he was worthy. I don't see any sins in there that would prevent him from being our prophet. But there's one reality, and that is that in the Bible and in Joseph Smith's day, men could practice polygamy, women couldn't. It's unequal. It's not fair. And today, fairness is a big deal. And it's hard for us to wrap our heads and our hearts around a practice that is this unfair. And people will say, I don't believe in a God who would create something so unfair or allow it or command it. And my response to that, and it echoes Elder Renlund's talk from a couple of years ago, but there is unfairness from our perspective in this world. Our God will send a baby to be born in Africa to poverty. At the same time, a baby is born in Boston or in Mexico City to privilege. And that's very unfair from my perspective, and I think from everybody's perspective, but God is doing it, and we believe God is fair. But we can't see things the way he sees things. And this would be the same with the practice of plural marriage. It was commanded for a time. From our perspective, it doesn't seem fair, but until we can understand it through God's eyes, which I think we will be able to at some point in the far future, we just have to withhold judgment and trust the scriptures that tell us that we will have a fullness of joy if we are obedient, patient, meek, and are able to be submissive during this period of time. That might not be the best answer, but honestly, life is unfair. And so to reject a God that is commanding something that seems unfair just seems very short-sighted to me, and not a really good way to respond to it. So that would be my suggestion.
Okay, perfect, Brother Hales. Thank you so much, and again, thank you for your time and for the research you've done. I think it's pretty helpful. It's helped me a lot when I try to understand the practice and what we know about it. So again, thank you so much for being on the show today. And I don't know, do you have any last words before we wrap up?
Well, I will also include a link to my new research, which is on the Book of Mormon. And it's a lot more fun to talk about the Book of Mormon than to talk about polygamy. So maybe you can have me come back sometime. But the people would ask me when I was researching polygamy, are you worried about something you're going to learn about Joseph that would hurt your belief in him as a prophet? And I said, no, because in 1829, when he dictated the Book of Mormon, that was way beyond his abilities. And so I believe he was a prophet when he created the Book of Mormon. So I believe he still was a prophet 10 or 15 years later. And so after I finished researching polygamy, I went back to test that theory. Could Joseph have created the Book of Mormon using his own intellect? And there's just no way at all. And I'll put a link to a handout. You're free to share that. But what I've done is just taken the skills that Joseph demonstrated while he was dictating and then compare it to the skills that people who knew him said he had. And there's a huge disconnect, a gap there that I think was filled with God's Spirit, with the gift and power of God. And this is a strong testimony to me, and I think to anybody who looks at it who has a little faith, that God was there in 1829, and that's how we got the Book of Mormon through Joseph Smith. And God never left Joseph because he was always worthy.
Okay, thank you. And I think that once we've covered many of these different topics, it all goes back to that. We'll talk about the Book of Mormon in the end. Maybe we've talked about polygamy or Freemasonry or things like that, but it always goes back to that simple test, reading in and asking. So thank you for sharing that. Y a cada uno de ustedes, gracias por ver este episodio. Como comentamos, podríamos hablar mucho de este tema. Apenas rascamos la superficie. Entonces, si les interesa aprender de estas cosas, pues dejaré el link del sitio del hermano Hales con los documentos que ha encontrado, con la investigación que ha hecho. Y recuerden, al final, el propósito de estos videos y del canal es que el viaje de fe de cada uno de nosotros sea más informado.